I think that the best way to start the conversation is to begin with how you are all dealing now as a business matter with the existing opportunities now, the changes that are happening currently in the system, and then we can move into a discussion from there of, you know, the future and where we see it going. And I think that the other thing I would say, and then I'll shut up and let you all comment, is that I think it's important to focus on opportunities and to focus on the positive. You know, I understand that people have, there are problems with the CRTC from time to time, but I know I read a speech of Mr. Blay, and he was saying that in 2012 the CRTC received 11,500 complaints just in 2012. So, you know, I assume 50 more complaints won't go that far with the CRTC. So I think the focus should really be ideally on opportunities. I mean, obviously there are challenges, but the ways to address the challenges. So if anyone wants to kick it off boldly with views on how they're dealing with television now, Steve.
Why not be the first? Hi, Steve Woodell. I'm the National Executive Director of ACTRA. You know, opportunities. There's a lot of opportunities in the digital realm in television these days. All of these platforms are now available to us. All of the variety of ways in which content is distributed are multiple, and I think there's some great opportunities for all of us. But the whole issue with respect to content in this era is it's all about the content. It's the content which is important. The pipes are, you know, we can all chat about the pipes and how the delivery systems and the technology and so on. But all of the delivery systems are all delivering the content, and it's the content that's important. And I think from a Canadian perspective, or from a perspective of our organization and of performers and other creators generally, Canadian creators, it's about Canadian content and ensuring that we have high quality and distinctive content that Canadians want to watch, that says something to Canadians about themselves, about their stories. So whatever can be put into place, the current regulations are fine. We'd like to see them improved. But it's necessary, in our view, to continue to have regulations to require Canadian content be produced, and that there be funding mechanisms, and there are great funding mechanisms in place through the Canadian Media Fund, and of course the money that's available through the benefits packages that's creating terrific content. So, you know, let's continue with the systems that are in place. Let's not deregulate as some would want. Let's, you know, make as much content as we can as distinctive, and that should be as high quality and distinctive as possible.
Okay, great comment. And under our system now, as I'm sure most people in this room would know, the CRTC regulates broadcasters through broadcast licenses, and they have to show a minimum amount of Canadian programming every day, every week. And of course, some of the newer entrants are not subject to those rules. So the over-the-top services, the internet services are not part of that system, and there is no particular quota of Canadian shows that they need to show in a day at all. So that's maybe something someone might be interested in touching on. Just
I'm happy to do
there
it
you go.
again. Sorry, I don't want to dominate.
Didn't mean to feed you a straight line, but sure.
I do have some views on all of this. And that is with respect to Netflix and iTunes, who are taking money out of the system, taking money from Canadian consumers. It's time that they put the money back in, that they make contributions like other providers do, like the cable companies and the satellite companies, that they too should be making contributions to the Canadian Media Fund, because they're benefiting from Canadian consumers. They should also make a contribution back into the system.
Any other views? Yes.
David Sparrow, I'm president of ACTRA Toronto, and it's a pleasure to be here today. You know, just building off of what Steve Woodell was speaking of, it kind of strikes me that with these new platforms, new media, et cetera, these over-the-top systems you're talking about, that this should truly be the age of the creator. And that the people in this room, the production people who work so hard through their companies to develop new ideas and to create good Canadian stories and drama and to reflect Canadian society should be the ones that are truly driving this business. And yet it appears that through consolidation of media, that instead broadcasters and through the CMF, because of broadcast envelopes and similar, that there are folks who are often bean counters, et cetera, who are actually in charge of the kind of content that we're going to receive and how Canadians are going to receive it. We need to, I think, remind the CRTC and remind ourselves that it's only through the largesse of the Canadian people that these airwaves and now digital pathways are made available to broadcasters, and somehow we have allowed through the regulatory bodies to allow them to be in the driver's seat. And as actors are creators, and as actors are wanting to tell Canadian stories and to project Canadian culture to the world, and as producers are wanting to do that, I think that we perhaps need to help our industry partners at the political level to understand that we want to be the drivers and the creative energy behind the future of Canadian stories. We don't want it all to be lost to simply the large producer to the south. And it's important whether conventional broadcasters continue to exist or whether it all goes to the internet, that Canadian voices aren't lost in that transition and in that sea. And in this country, because of our economy of scale, we're going to have to rely on our regulatory body to actually come out and champion and protect those interests into the future.
Great, thank you. And we have now, the CMF changed their rules a few years ago around the time that they changed their name from the Canadian Television to the Canadian Media Fund to have a digital component and to encourage a digital component with a television component as being mandatory for a lot of their funding. How are people dealing with that reality now? In other words, those of you with film companies, how are you adapting to this changing world with the different technologies? For example, I was just in New York yesterday, and people were talking about producing original programming directly for these over-the-top services. So I'm sure you've seen this growing phenomenon of things like House of Cards and Orange is the New Black and shows now for Amazon and Hulu, and you can see this kind of growing. And here in Canada, not only are these not mostly Canadian entities, they're mostly non-Canadian entities that are commissioning this programming, but they're also not regulated, as these gentlemen were saying, in our system. So what's the approach now if you're a producer? Scott or Ira?
Sure, I'll start. Ira Levy from Breakthrough. I think one of the challenges is also one of the opportunities. I mean, the challenge really is exactly what people have been talking about. You have consolidations, so you have less gatekeepers that you can approach in Canada to actually produce shows with all the great Canadian performers and writers and directors and crews, etc. So if you look at the opportunity of the over-the-tops, the Hulus and Netflix, etc., they actually can become a good partner working with you and then reapproaching the Canadian broadcasters. It almost has to work in reverse, which is sort of unfortunate because that's not the way it used to be, but that's the reality that we're facing right now.
Okay, and just going back to a point that Steve made, so Steve was making the point that he feels that they should be regulated, that they should contribute to the system. And and Ira, in your case, so if you're dealing with Netflix now, if Netflix has a first window on a Canadian TV show, that won't trigger a film tax credit.
Well, I think that's
under the Canadian rules. So go ahead.
Well, that's the other
so what do you
part
think about that?
Well, it's that the funding system is antiquated. It's about 10 years behind the delivery system and what consumers want. So somehow, through regulation, you have to open up the fact that the way shows are being produced and the fact that in many cases we have foreign partners, whether they be in the States or whether they be on other platforms or whether they be through international co-production, that a number of the funds that currently are helping to fund Canadian content shows need to be adapted so that it fits into having other triggers to trigger that money, as long as those shows are in fact being produced in Canada.
So then you would be in favor of, for example, having the tax credit rules changed so that if you had a show exhibited in Netflix, then that would be, could trigger a credit. Right now, the requirement is that it has to be exhibited on a CRTC licensed broadcast service.
Yeah, no,
If it's a TV show.
absolutely, but I think it also speaks to what Stephen was talking about,
Right.
which is Netflix in Canada should also be contributing to that, and they can then become a trigger if they're putting money into a Canadian show, for example.
Okay, so maybe that could even be the quid pro quo, where you say that, you know, this will encourage production, but you need to contribute. Yeah, yes, Maureen.
Hi, Maureen Parker, Writers Guild of Canada. To join this conversation, I was in Ottawa last weekend having a great discussion with some of our MPs about the importance of regulating over-the-top services. And as we know, the new media exemption order is up in 2014. So there is an opportunity in the next year, according to CRTC regs, to actually have this discussion. And I think it's an essential discussion for us. And as we were touching upon, creators, certainly our screenwriters, need more doors to knock on. With consolidation, you know, the world has become very small. There are 2 or 3 broadcast executives, you know, that run the system. And it's very difficult for creators to go in with producer partners and pitch a project where you know that perhaps the theme of the year is police episodic procedurals. What about originality? What about, and not that these aren't original, please don't misunderstand me. It's just there is a whole range of ideas, and we should be able to put those forward. And we need diversity in the system. And when we talk about Netflix, and Steve Waddell was importantly saying the contribution that you know, that Netflix needs to make to our system. So let's say, throw it out there that you know, perhaps they do make a contribution to the CMF. We know CMF revenue is starting to decline, so we do have to look for other monies. And as Ira was saying, there has to be a system change. So the question I was getting from politicians in Ottawa was, okay, if they contribute to CMF, will they be able to access it? And I think that that's a very valid question, and it means that we do have to look down the line and look at tax credits and other funding mechanisms to see what we need to do to make the system work. We can't just regulate without also expanding the benefits of regulation. So I think the overall message is certainly for us that we need regulation. Regulation is not a dirty word, as some like to believe, but we need smart regulation. We need adaptive, flexible regulation. And we hope that the CRTC is prepared to go there and not afraid to address, in this time where everyone, you know, is purporting libertarian views, that regulation is important for a Canadian voice.
Okay, great, thank you. And in terms of, you know, moving a little bit towards the future, which is obviously the main focus of this conversation, is the CRTC looking for guidance on the future. So, I'm certainly no particularly great foreseer of the future. It's not one of my particular strengths, as opposed to reviewing legal contracts. That's a little easier. But I guess, you know, looking out and looking at the rapid changes we've seen with new technology and new delivery systems, and now these internet services and the internet digital world dominating our lives, it's not hard to project out a few years and see the challenges that there might be for the existing Canadian TV system, which everyone relies on here to make a living. And so I wonder if anybody wants to comment on that issue. In other words, you know, be bold and look out 10 years, never mind 2 years. Where is this all heading? Right now, we have, you know, I keep using my poor kids as an example, good thing they're not here, but, you know, my kids just access content over the internet whenever they feel like it. And to them, that's the natural place to go. They've grown up with this. You know, my 12-year-old daughter is perplexed by anyone that wouldn't start with the internet. You know, when we watch live television and you can't fast forward it, she gets all confused. Like, what is this strange thing? There's somebody from Procter & Gamble talking to me about something. Like, why do I have to listen to that? We just fast forward. So, you know, conventional commercial television, it's obviously going to be a challenge. I think everybody realizes it. So if this keeps evolving and we're sitting here 20 years from now, whatever, what will the system look like? Because the CRTC has to look out in advance and try and think about how this is going to change, and there are some people, I'm not necessarily one of these people, but some people who say, oh, there'll be the demise of conventional television completely. It'll really just be internet services, and that's why, for example, you see Rogers has spent so much money, $5 billion to acquire rights to a sports property, because of course sports is something that you watch in real time, and it's something that has that immediate value. You can't take away local news and sports and watch it a week later. It's not the same thing. And you can see this a lot of money, in fact, even Rogers and Bell buying the Maple Leaf Sports and taking control of Maple Leaf Sports, even separate from that. So you can see the scramble of people to find content that will be valuable going forward. So what do you think about this? Do you care? Are you agnostic because you're creating content and it won't really matter? Will you give jobs to these people when they're fired later in 6 or 7 years?
Could I?
Sure.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question. I have no knowledge of the technicalities of making this stuff other than when I sit down to negotiate with a number of people here at certain times. But I would like to make the point, when you talk about 10 years from now, it seems to me that this is a cultural industry. That's the kind of TV I'm interested in. I'm not interested in sports. I'm not interested in news. And I'm interested in artists using the television as an art form. And we see the art form developing in other countries to an incredible extent. I would say America, I would say Britain. I see wonderful, actually groundbreaking. And the point I want to make is that that comes from a cultural specific place. One is American television. And I think that I feel often that we forget that this is a cultural industry. It's not an industry per se, in the sense that we're like a car industry. That is, I can buy a car from America, and it comes to my house in Canada with no cultural content in it, no propaganda in it, no other. And what I feel is that as Canadians, in Canadian television, we're so easy to see the system of things, how to make money of this, about gatekeepers and regulations. So I'm really trying to go down to a really fundamental visionary point about this. That TV is, of course, one of the main pillars of popular culture. And and I live in a country where we're kind of in English Canada, I speak only of English Canada. I don't think that there's two other groups in my mind in Canada I don't think have the same problem, because they do operate from a cultural starting point. Not an industrial starting point, a need to express. And what I'm talking about is artists of all stripes, writers, producers, directors, actors, scenic designers, being Canadian and expressing what artists are supposed to do, to express themselves, and that makes a connection to a Canadian audience. Now, I live in a country where it's like an upside down boat in a way. It's kind of inversed, where foreign or TV product from other countries is the norm, and Canadian product seems to be abnormal. I get this when I walk to a film set to act. I have to sign documents to prove I'm a Canadian. But an American on that same set doesn't sign anything. So, I mean, this is, again, my sense of inversion in this, that in my own country I have to prove what I am. And I feel that sometimes we're living in it's like the Canadian aspect of it. It's very difficult to generate the kind of quality and it's not even expertise. It's the kind of artistic quality that marries an audience to you. We don't have to force them to watch it. They want to watch it because it's theirs. And it's that specific validation, that specific I mean, a lot of things follow from that, but it's validation for the artist himself that he is on the right track. And from that specific, universality, then you're also producing something that may or may not be valuable to world culture, that is, can be sold. But we seem to live, again, something is judged good Canadian-wise if it sells someplace else, as opposed to the first gate should be that Canadians want it and love it. And again, the importance to the Canadian, and I'm speaking of the Canadian English audience, so I'm not sure what is necessary. I've lived through regulations. I've seen better and worse times for Canadian content in the sense that, but I want to marry it to the very center of the business and not the industrial systems, different platforms. All that still comes down to what is important to us as artists in this field. And the important thing is a connection to our own audience and a strong connection to it. And from that, things will begin to follow. And mostly that we'll get better and better and better at it, because we're speaking from a true place in our hearts about something in an art form that has a lot to offer.
Okay, so just before we get to the next comment, so I completely agree. If you look at the Broadcasting Act, culture is prominently mentioned in the Broadcasting Act. And if you look at the system here, we have different types of tax credits, lower ones for shooting on location in Canada. So if you're Warner Brothers or Disney, come on up to Canada and you can get that lower credit. The higher credit can only go to a Canadian-controlled production. And so, unlike the United States has credits in over 40 states. Those credits are just about shooting in the state. Shoot in Massachusetts, you're shooting, Breaking Bad was shot in New Mexico because they had a lovely incentive. And so they shot it in Alberta because of the film incentive. And another production shot in Massachusetts or Connecticut. So it's nothing to do with culture. The American incentives, right? They just have to do with come to my state.
No, it's still to do with, I mean, put that point to you, they don't have to worry about their culture.
Yes.
Because they're just exploiting
Yes.
someplace
Yes.
else to produce their culture.
Right, but my point is, agreeing with you, my point is that they have a very strong the reason the U.S. has no co-production agreements with any country is they don't need a film co-production agreement. It's Hollywood, right? They don't need to have an agreement with Germany and Malaysia.
Message as well.
It's and other countries in the world do. So I agree with that. My point is really just to, again, bring it back, your point, to the CRTC and their rules now and what their rules might be. So now, their approach to your issue, not defending it or criticizing it, but just trying to be very neutral, their approach is to say, okay, we're going to address your point. So number one, we require a certain number of Canadian programs on all these different broadcast services by license. If you're CBC, it's a whole lot. If you're a private broadcaster, it might be less. And we define what a Canadian show is. Because the whole system wouldn't work unless we defined what a Canadian show. We have to be able to count them. So we define it. And the basic definition, there's many definitions, but the most basic one is the points test, right? Which we all know. 6 out of 10 points, writer or director Canadian, lead or second lead actor Canadian. And that and spending 75% of the money in Canada and post in Canada. So that is the Canadian test the CRTC has. It's also the test that the tax credit authorities use. The only people that don't use that test are really the CMF and some of the funding organizations where they have a different test that talks about themes and stories and things set in Canada. But for the most part, the CRTC and the other authorities don't. So I guess turning to your point on culture, then is that the right approach? Should they change the approach?
Well, I'm not sure about what that should be. I mean, if I could just answer that, but we do have a sizable generic industry here that goes against the specific cultural mandate that I'm talking about. That is, we will do things like the Americans for the American market cheaper. And I'm not sure that's the kind of cultural situation I'm after, and I'm not sure the point system that you're talking about actually leads to that.
Okay.
I'm still thinking I want to see things that strengthen this mythical connection between artist and his specific audience in a specific country. The way a poet is, or we see it more successfully in other art forms in this country. For example, writing novels, we have that in the music industry. And again, like your children, my children find their music on the World Wide Web. They don't listen to a radio station that gives it to them. They find it out there. And when I go on the World Wide Web, there's Canadian music out there with everybody else. And that's a hugely significant thing too. Okay. In a way, I'm talking about a colonized mind in a sense, and trying to battle more strongly against that in a way.
Okay, so Brian, you have
Well, first of all, I want to say I completely agree with everything my brother Eric Peterson says. you asked an interesting question, which is let's look 10 years out and ask ourselves what that's going to look like. And I think the central fact on that question is that American content is now directly available through the internet and will be absolutely available in 10 years. And you can see it, as you were saying, you can see it through smart TVs that you can buy for $600, and you can see it on iTunes and Apple TV and Google TV and Microsoft apps and Hulu and Amazon, and these channels are only going to become more powerful and easier to get at. So eyeballs in Canada will be able to directly access American content, and so it is not going to be possible to build a Canadian broadcasting system on getting ticks as Canadians watch American shows, which has essentially been the funding model that we've had for about 3 decades. And the whole CRTC mission, which is to hold that system together, has had its day. So the good news, in building on the case that we must find our cultural voice, is that Canadian content is going to be just as easy to see through those channels. But it's not going to get those eyeballs unless it's just as compelling and just as impossible not to watch as other shows that are available from other production communities. And so the challenge that we face as an industry is not dissimilar to what happened to the Ontario wine industry, 15 years ago, which is the walls are all going to come down, it's all going to be on the shelf, and your stuff has to be just as good as everybody else's, and if it is, then people will buy it because it's theirs and they'll be proud of it. And so how do you do that? One of the key issues, because we need to focus on the nuts and bolts of the game, is that's going to take a lot of money that has as its purpose to produce globally competitive production, as opposed to ticking quotas and minimum regulatory compliance and filling up Sunday nights so that you can run tons of American content that you can get a tick on. So where will that money come from? And I think, this is the last thing I want to say, I think the 4 obvious pillars of building what must come next, which is to compete at the high end instead of minimum regulatory compliance, which is what we've seen from players up to now, is first of all extremely robust public television. And most cultures, other than America, invest in public television. And the smart ones that are currently globally competitive, like BBC and the 3 German networks, the Spanish network, to some extent the Australians, make public broadcasting independently funded so that it is not at the mercy of capricious governments who don't like what they see on the news shows. And so not just the CRTC, but everyone who loves Canadian content on screens needs to pick up that cost. And then the price of that is CBC needs to turn its lights on. And there's a lot that we can say about that. Just two other quick points. Then you follow the money for the private side of things. Follow the money. Where is the money? The money is in supplying the broadband. It's the fiber optics, the copper, and the satellite signals that are all through form of public rents delivered to people's homes in return for $100, $200 a month in fees. That's the money. And people buy those wires so they can see the content. And so those providers who have the privilege of selling that product through regulatory rent should be contributing back. And then there's the revenue that you earn by making great shows, the pay per tick, right? I want to watch this, I click it, $5 gets deducted from my credit card, and some of it must find its way back to the producer and to the creators so that they can produce the content. And then you earn the advertising because the eyeballs follow it. So those 4 pillars: public broadcasting, follow the money and charge for it, and then earn money through pay-per-view and through advertising. That's the future. And if we don't build it, then the future is everybody plugs in their $600 smart TVs and watches American stuff. And because of what Eric said, we cannot allow that to happen.
Okay, so I think
Can I just remind people to introduce yourself before you speak to us? So that we have
that was Brian Topp from Film Ontario. And just to pick up on some of Brian's points, because you raised a lot of interesting points, Brian, I think. One point Brian made was the role of the public broadcaster. We all own CBC. We're all owners of CBC here in this room, and our tax money goes to fund CBC. So, and Eric, you're talking about culture and all that, and I think Brian made another good point, and again, not to make judgments, but just to really deal in facts, because I don't feel I want to impose any views, in this discussion is, obviously we have private broadcasters and we have the CBC. The private broadcasters are mostly publicly traded companies. I mean, if you can buy a share of Bell, you can buy a share of Shaw, you can buy a share of Rogers. They trade on the stock exchange. They're big integrated companies. They have many other businesses like wireless and wireline and satellite and all sorts of things going on, and media divisions as well. So, you know, there's this importance of culture and having Canadian culture and showing it, and yet, apart from the CBC, you have for-profit companies with shareholders who are probably mostly interested in their stock going up. Most people I know own stock, want to see it go up. They're not particularly interested in culture one way or the other. Some may be, some may not be, but I think they're more interested in the performance of the company. So that needs to be reconciled. Again, not to just saying what the facts are. It just needs to be reconciled with whatever is proposed to the CRTC. And to your point, Brian, the model has been historically, like as I've been doing this for about 30 years, and through most of my career, the model for the private broadcasters was really, as Brian was saying, you know, based on, you know, how can you sustain the system? And the way to sustain it was to get the most popular shows, the most eyeballs, because then you can sell the most commercial advertising for the highest amount of money. And that traditionally meant going down to Los Angeles and competing with your fellow Canadian private broadcasters to get the very hottest, best new shows that have the biggest ratings, and then coming back to Canada and airing those shows, and through the magic of the Canadian system, simultaneously broadcasting it on your signal and on the signal of the American network that is running it, as long as you run it at the same time. So obviously, if you're CTV or you're Shaw, you pick up a show that NBC or CBS is running, and you run it at the same time. If you turn on the TV and you turn on what you think is the NBC or CBS channel, you're getting, under our Canadian rules, you see the broadcast of CTV or Shaw or Bell. And you see the advertisements that have been sold to the Canadian Chrysler dealer, not the American Chrysler dealer. And so you have this extra source of revenue. So that was historically, and then there was the CRTC saying, and you need Canadian shows as a condition of a license, because we gave you a license, and so you must have a certain number, and then more recently you need some shows of national interest, programs of national interest. And the CMF saying we want to target certain underrepresented areas like documentary and drama, for example. So I guess what I'm saying is that, as you're saying, Brian, as this starts to unravel, this former reality, the CRTC is going to need to have direction as to what to do. You were giving some ideas. I mean, in England, they have a lottery, for example. There's a national lottery, and some of the money from the lottery finds its way into arts funding. There's other creative ways to finance the arts, but clearly the old approach of hermetically sealed Canada, where you rent foreigner shows and show them to the Canadian population and get lots of money from Canadian advertisers, and you have the exclusive rights in Canada, no one else can see it. I mean, that model is broken now and is just going to unravel more and more. So I think all of us need to address that. So lots of comments there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Michael McLennan. I'm a screenwriter. I'm here with the Writers Guild of Canada. I want to just emphasize two things. Going back to I try to synthesize some of these ideas here and talk a bit about the future. And to just inject a note of, in my perception, urgency to this discussion. We're getting a lot of studies around the phenomenon of cord cutting, and that there's nothing really to worry about. We're only looking at 1 or 2% annually. But I think about what you say about your children, and the fact is that if I'm to imagine the world 10 years from now, I think we're looking at a circumstance where most of our content is not going to be consumed on a traditional television platform. So the questions that you raise around the kind of travesty, really, of simulcasts and the way that certainly private broadcasters, privately traded companies that make use of our public airwaves are allowed to do this. I'm less interested in that battle at this point, because I think that that's a model of consumption that is quickly going away. But what is, and so that I'm not in agreement with those who will tell me, because it suits them, that we have nothing to worry about with cord cutting, and that that's the primary way that who will continue to garner revenue and so forth. So I think what we need to be really thinking about as content providers is that in the future, it's going to be coming through various, through the technologies that are currently not regulated. I'll just at this point call it the internet, but we know it's much more complicated than that. And that unless we very quickly make some difficult choices around how we regulate the sort of Netflix question of it all, which is a very complicated question. How do you regulate electrons, essentially, through, you're not talking about, I can't get into the specifics of it. I think many of us here understand why it's a very difficult thing to fight for, because it's a kind of precedent around controlling something that you don't own as a country. But unless we figure out a way to do this, we are not going to have the funds to make original content. We aren't going to have we're not going to have necessarily platforms on which to consume the Canadian content that is going to be visible. And we're not going to have ways of qualifying as, quote, Canadian content, whether it's the 6 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. And so, and I feel that this is, if we don't make these decisions now, if the result of this kind of process that the CRTC is going through isn't to, if the result is to wait and see, we're going to be left behind, because there are very exciting other things that are happening in other countries. Germany, England and Israel have been mentioned, they come to mind, where they have a robust public broadcaster and an interest in seeing those things financed. And in the system that we have now, it's shrinking, and we're going to be left behind at a time when we really need to have our voice heard both within our own country and internationally. And I think that finally, I want to echo what Maureen said about the importance of diversity of places, of platforms, because right now there's really only sort of 3.5 places that a content provider can go if they want to offer up a vision for a Canadian show. And that unless we start to broaden the sense of what's possible there, we're going to be in trouble.
Okay, and I would just add to your comments that, which I think are all good, that you think about Canada, we're really different than many of the other countries in the world. The big difference is that we speak English. I was just in New York and they understood me perfectly. I ordered a lovely pappardelle with tomato sauce. There was no issue. When you think about Germany, you think about France, you think about these other countries, you can imagine if you're German, you speak German, it's your main language, how there is a ready market for German language programming or Russian language programming or French language programming. So you have these other countries who, yes, there is Hollywood Fair coming and they have some threats, but there's this, whether it's China and they have their own indigenous films that do extremely well in China, not just the Hollywood blockbusters. But here in Canada, in English Canada, I know you were talking about that, and of course you see the difference between French and English Canada. Look, for example, at feature films, and how in relative terms, with no disrespect to any English-Canadian feature filmmakers in the crowd, French-Canadian feature films have really historically always done much better than English-Canadian feature films. They've had a much, much bigger share of the domestic audience. They've made much more money in relative terms. They've had a disproportionate share of awards and so forth. And obviously, there's many talented people in Quebec, but one reason is also there's a language issue as well.
And I might say that they work from a cultural base. It's not the language.
And there's a cultural difference as well.
Germans speak English. We all live close to the Americans.
Yes.
The Brits speak English. So I don't think the language one is a bit of a red herring, I think.
Okay.
Unless you're working from a cultural point that is expressing, everybody understands.
If I can just say something more on that. I think that the flip side of that is that they're not having quite the same discussion in Quebec because of their cultural and linguistic advantage, I guess, that they have a kind of an ability to protect it. But by the same token, and I'm here with colleagues who do the same thing I do, it's very easy for me to go. I live next door to the largest cultural producer on the planet, and I share the same language. And to some degree, I share the same culture. So I'm kind of like culturally bilingual, you could say. And I have a home in the United States, I work in the United States, and it's very easy for me to just slide down there and continue and to produce, to make the work that I do through that model. But for some bizarre reason, I'm not interested in only doing that. But what happens is, in the absence of systems and regulations that encourage, and I would say force, people to spend a small amount of their profits or a small amount of their taxes however you want to dress it up. That's what's going to happen. I mean, there's a tremendous creative force that comes out of Canada, and either it's going to stay here or it'll go south. And so the risk isn't just that American product comes into our lives, it's that we become American for all extents and purposes. And that to me is the more sort of pernicious, if you think long term, that's the more pernicious ill that we're facing here, is the idea that we start to believe that our only way of making a go of it is by going south. And if I may say just one last comment, that I think that we're talking about this at a time where Canadian television has been making tremendous strides in these last few years. And counter to the opinions of somebody like John Doyle, I think we have very much to be proud of, and we have an incredible opportunity right now to seize and to build on. And if we're not careful with the ways that things are financed, we're going to see that slip away.
Right, and those shows have been produced with the existing system. In other words, the Rookie Blues, the Flashpoints, the Saving Hopes have been done through the existing system that supports the Canadian
They were only
producers.
done because they had to be done, but they then become things that people want to watch, I think, as Brian was saying.
Okay, great. Sir, lots of comments.
I'm Aaron Martin. I'm a screenwriter and here with the WGC. And I'm not as well spoken as some people, but I will. What I've discovered since I started in 2000 working on Degrassi, which is probably Canada's biggest cultural export, is that more and more when we go to the networks, we have to pitch shows that can play in the States, and that becomes the defining characteristic of your show, which seems weird and wrong. Not that I haven't done it, I have, but the shows that I've worked on that have been ironically most successful up here and in the States are the shows that are clearly Canadian. Yeah. So Degrassi, I can go to anybody in LA and they know what Degrassi is, and Being Erica, I can go into any room in LA and they know what Being Erica is. And I actually just got a pilot with CBS based on Being Erica. And it's this weird kind of thing where Saving Hope, which is another show I did, I'm not putting it down, but that show, which is generic, doesn't have the same kind of currency. And what I'm trying to get to, the point is that regulations or whatever, what's going to draw people to a TV show is if it's good or not. It doesn't matter if it's Canadian, if it's American, if it's British. It just matters if it's good. And there's a lack of braveness up here to push the boundary that they do in the States. I mean, the people watch shows in the States because they're good. They watch Walking Dead because it's good. They don't watch it because it's American. They watch Grey's Anatomy because it's good. And it's never, the onus isn't on trying to figure out if it's Canadian, it's about trying to figure out if it's a good show. And I'm hoping that maybe the fact that things are going to be deregulated will maybe focus us back onto that.
But what do you think the CRTC should do? Like, again, accepting all your points as being excellent, where you're really saying that it's not about making, it's about making a good show, and Canadians making a good show that's recognized around the world as a good show, which I think everyone would agree with here. I think no one's interested in making a bad show that is a Canadian show that's foisted on people. I think people feel that they can make a good show that, like Degrassi, that will be desired around the world and in the US and other markets. But, we're trying to help the CRTC here too.
Well, I mean,
and so they're really looking for help in terms of, okay, going forward, what can we do? What in terms of what their role is. Right now their role is regulating the Canadian broadcast system. Maureen pointed out that they're not really regulating the internet in any meaningful way yet. They're open to potentially doing it. The exemption order is now many years old, where they essentially said the internet's off limits. We're not even going to look at it. And it may be that it would be very difficult to regulate the internet, even if they decide to regulate the internet. Obviously, regulating the internet, as we can all guess, is a very tricky thing when you have people from other countries around the world. They're not based here. They're the ones that are uploading content. That said, there's obviously ways to do it. Steve's giving me the dirty look here, but there's obviously mechanisms to do it. So my point is just, taking what you're saying. So what can the CRTC do?
I think actually to look at what's happening in the States is an interesting model, because in the States, standard broadcast television is failing. And the reason people are going to shows is because there's such a wide range of people you can pitch to. You can make shows like Orange is the New Black. You can make Walking Dead. You can make all these shows that actually aren't on network that people go to. Like 12 million people a week go to Walking Dead, and that's a different model that didn't exist 10 years ago. And so Canada, I think for the CRTC, what they should be doing is supporting different streams, so that, like you said, there's only 3.5 places you can go in this country to get something made, and those 3.5 places are monopolies that I know I can't pitch a serialized show in this country, and that's even though that's the thing that people are watching, it's impossible to pitch that up here. And that's a problem.
Okay. Now the 3.5, there's been a lot of talk about consolidation among the audience so far. And when you say the 3.5 buyers, right? Again, we're kind of going back to the system now.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. Like Netflix Canada, if that is, or Twitter Canada, or all the other things that are going on in the States where you've got different people who are making shows that are willing to take risks. Amazon.
I mean, for the time being, most of the money that is being dispersed is coming from those traditional players.
Yeah.
And the CRTC's regulatory efforts have been the vast, vast majority focused on those players. If you added up all the hearings that dealt with Rogers and Shaw and Bell and the Astral acquisition and the Family Channel now being bought by DHX and on, you would see the CRTC spends an enormous amount of time thinking about and regulating and having hearings and discussing the lives of those incumbents, And I think, in fairness, there's been some negative comments about them, obviously, but for the time being, those are the people that are mostly licensing shows from Ira and Scott and paying them fees that go into their companies and so forth. So I guess, again, not really agreeing with most of what you're saying. Where does that leave the CRTC? When you say it's those 3.5 buyers, that's they're regulating those 3.5 buyers and not much else right now.
Yeah.
So,
I think then just to follow what's going, like you're saying, in 10 years we're going to only have, it's not going to be the standard model, and to jump on that now as opposed to 10 years from now.
Right. So the same point, which is we have to figure out what the heck to do.
Yeah.
Going forward, if we want to maintain distinct Canadian voices and culture. What the heck? Now's the time.
And not wait till 40%
There's no
of the
time to
households have
dawdle. We
television.
have to kind of, this time with the CRTC, who will have a full hearing in September. They're going to commence it in the spring, but in September of 2014, they're going to have a full hearing. I think one of the messages I'm hearing is that there's some urgency. Like you fellows and ladies have to figure out what to do quickly. Or else there is a danger that if we wait another few years with the existing system, this is just going to get more and more of a problem. So, sorry, sir.
My name is James Sisson. I'm a director and have a very small independent production company. And I agree with almost all of the comments that have been made, except for and no disrespect to Eric, it's still a business. And you're right, there's 3.5, maybe 3.25 people you can pitch to today, and if you don't have a great relationship with them, it's very difficult. Especially when one of the executives at one of the companies has been on record saying that Canadian programming is a tax he pays in order to buy American programming. So I think that's true, and I think that's real, and I think the CRTC has done, for all intents and purposes, a reasonably good job of regulating the current system, because it is a system. The issue is somebody still has to pay for it. And if you look at what, say, use your kids as an example, where they go on multiple screens, somebody's still got to pay for that. And right now our system is they sell advertising, et cetera. We know how it works. Well, as the broadcast model slowly disintegrates over the next few years, we need to look at ways that there can be, money can be found to pay for screenwriters and actors and producers and make this still a profitable business. And one great example is a CBS show right now called The Crazy Ones. Now, whether or not you think it's good or bad or indifferent is irrelevant. What's really unique about this show is that the executive producer is Leo Burnett Advertising. And they've set this system up, and it's with Robin Williams.
They don't have editorial control, but they have the ability to place their products inside a TV show that talks about their products and their strengths and their weaknesses, that still has to, pass scrutiny with the consumers, not a, 30-minute commercial. And so I think the CRTC, my answer back to what can they do, is start looking at unique ways and more innovative ways of raising capital, raising money to pay for the people that make the shows. And it's not simply subscriber-based. It's not simply click-throughs, even though that's a great way to generate revenue. If they don't know it's there, they can't click it. So I think in looking at the tax credit programs or looking at some sort of innovative funding programs where the CRTC can promote people having unique and innovative ways of raising money or generating revenue in order to make the shows. And I think that's where the future is, trying to stay a little bit ahead of the curve rather than reacting to an old system that, whether it's broken or not, doesn't matter because it's going to be gone in a few years. So instead of worrying about how badly that buggy works and your whip's not getting the horses going, who cares? No one's going to drive in a buggy. So let's figure out how to make cars work really well. And I think that's the challenge that they need to face, and I think that's where they need to go and start looking towards innovation, using the technology not as a crutch or an excuse, but as a tool to help drive forward the ability to tell stories that people want to see. And whether they're Canadian or not, I think that's a separate discussion. But you got to make good TV. And if they make good TV, they'll watch it. And I think just by proof of people like Michael and Semi Chellis, people like and Steve that have been down to the States and had good careers, have chosen to live here, certainly we can compete with anybody on any stage anywhere in the world. We just need somebody who has to pay for it. And it's not going to be selling a 30-second ad or just simply a click. It's going to be much more, it's going to be bigger than that because nobody knows what it is, and they need to be thinking in that vein.
Bonjour, I sit here as a Métis woman, an Aboriginal woman from this country, and I'm thrilled that the CRTC has invited me to participate in these discussions. It's certainly no secret that a lot of Aboriginal people are not brought to these discussions in the past, and so it's fabulous that we're finally here. We're sitting at the table, which is very, very important. I also think it's very interesting that the CRTC is starting a bottom-up approach. And so I'm also here to dispel a myth, which is often what you hear. There's a coined phrase that people use often where they say, we were at the bottom of the totem pole. So I'm just here to say that, in fact, that's a myth. The bottom of the totem pole is the most important place to be. That's where the chiefs are, and all of the community stands on top of the chiefs and all of the people who make those decisions. So the fact that we're here and we're considered the bottom is a really good thing. There's a couple of points I wanted to speak to. Okay, so I'm going to start with the idea of bundling or the CRT's recommendation of actually having people be able to look at their bundles. And my fear with that, and I'm totally against the idea, is that broadcasters like APTN then are in grave danger of not existing. And this is a very, very important voice in the Canadian culture that we must still have and we must find ways of supporting. So if we're looking at those ideas, or the CRTC is looking at the possibility of a new way of bundling the cable channels, this is not going to be good for us, especially if we're talking about Canadian culture and we're talking about voices and the different voices that we have in this country. We worked so hard to get APTN up and running. It needs support, it needs a lot more, it needs better infrastructure, but certainly what's not going to help is us, especially if we are looking at the top three, to start having people picking and choosing. It's going to actually do the opposite to what we've strived so hard to achieve. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was just this idea of broadband. Some of you may not know that it's only been in the last 10 years that some of the northern communities have even had access to broadband. So the other thing that I think, it's lovely sitting at the table with all, which I'm often at, a table of older white gentlemen. I think you're all fabulous. But what you may not know is some of the historical inequities that we're still dealing with. The Aboriginal communities, the cultural communities in this country are still running to catch up to the privilege that has been exercised, not only in our industry, but also, to a certain extent, by the top 3 who make choices on my behalf. And I'm very thrilled to be able to speak directly to them to say, please include me in the decisions that you make. Good content, absolutely. Let's make great television. So why not take that money that they are spending and buying those American programs and put it directly into Canadian content? It's a lot of money that goes to buy those programs in the South. If we're asking for money, if we're trying to find money, it's there. It needs to be put into Canadian programming so that we can have good Canadian programming. I'm hoping that that Canadian programming is also inclusive of cultural diversity, as well as the disability community, because they're non-existent on our airwaves right now. There are very few disabled actors, newscasters, anybody up there who represents that sector of our country, our citizens who work here, live here, pay taxes, go to banks, save their money. Canadian broadcasting, I've been very lucky. I was one of the actors who did well with CBC, everything from Movies of the Week to working with Ernie Coombs on the Mr. Dress-Up show. I played Granny. I got fan mail for Granny as a puppet from young Native kids in Alaska who looked to that character as an important part of their existence and somebody that they could look up to. Now, that may not make a whole lot of money for somebody, but I can say on one level, I think it saves lives. So I don't want to devalue the fact that good content and, well, you could argue, I don't know, whether Mr. Dress-Up was good Canadian content. I think it was, because it spoke to a demographic and it spoke to children in this country. There's very little children's programming now that even exists at all. My bottom line for creating an industry and supporting an industry is you have to, in order to support the art, you have to support the artists and the creators that make it. It's pretty bottom line for me. You cannot have an industry, you cannot have a business unless you support the people who actually make the content. So let's really focus on really what that means. The last point that I would like to make is the idea of cable access. So great, we've got Canadian content, we've got a certain point of the CRTC regulations that now say you have to create a certain amount of Canadian content. With my basic cable package, I can't even access a lot of that Canadian content. I am forced to go online to actually access the Canadian content that I'm supposed to have access to. So that's me in the city, where I still pay for my cable package and I still watch conventional television. If we keep focusing on taking away that cable access, that local access, and I'm in my head, I always have those Native communities in the far north, the people in Nunavut who we sit here speaking to and for and about, unless they've, hopefully, the CRTC has asked their opinion as well, although something in my heart says perhaps not. We speak for those people too, and they need access to local news. They don't want to know what's happening in Toronto. They want to know what's happening in Iqaluit. They want to know what's happening in Winnipeg. They want to know what's happening close to their local communities. The more we go to the broader spectrum of just making good television for a global market, and we start to lose our connection with community, I think we're going to be in more serious trouble down the road. The fact that we don't even know who we are as Canadians and how do we describe that, because when I think Canadian, I think First Peoples of here as well as all the immigrants who have come, who speak many different languages. But I feel that it's the CRTC's responsibility to speak for all of us and to include all of us in the decisions being made forward. Thank you.
Yeah, and the Broadcasting Act, diversity is one of the goals of the Broadcasting Act. So the CRTC has a statutory mandate to encourage diversity. So I think, you're absolutely right that they need to work into the mix the encouragement of diversity. Part of the issue though with what you were saying about bundling and pick and pay is the new chair of the CRTC has really said that he's a champion of consumers. And a lot of, in fact, if you look at the material for this particular conversation, a lot of it is oriented towards consumers. And what do consumers think? And so I think the tension will be obviously, to the extent that you have consumers saying, I want pick and pay, why are you forcing me to take channels I don't want? I want a lower bill every month. I don't want to pay more. You're making me take channels I don't want. Now, it's a very complicated issue because, as you know, you have got broadcasters who might say that if they were doing a la carte payment, in other words, pick whatever you want and I'll give you the fee for each, for the Aboriginal programming network and for this network and whatever, some people say that that'll be more expensive than if you have a bundle at the end of the day. So that wouldn't be very good for a consumer if they ended up paying more money. But these are the type of issues they'll definitely be wrestling with. I would imagine that the hearing that will come up, one of the main issues is likely going to be this issue of bundling or pick and pay. So I think that it's good that you're making the comment because you can get the input in to the CRTC, because they'll definitely be thinking about it. Yes, sir?
Mo D from Mo D Productions. Thank you for including me in the group of all the white guys that are here today. Appreciate it. Here's something is that a couple of years ago, obviously we knew what happened with the music industry. I think that it's kind of written on the wall that that's what's going to happen to the TV industry if we don't get creative revenue content happening, and that is getting into branded content. We talk about, Brad made a great point when he spoke about the bandwidths. We should be charging them to have something come in, and take a cut for that. I think if the CRTC doesn't start seeing the bigger picture and going to, go to Samsung, go to Sony, go to the TV makers, go to Apple and say, hey, listen, you know what? You're selling this much content or this much hardware into Canada. A certain percentage of it needs to be allocated over here. Brands, when we talk about the Gap, we talk about H&M, big brands like that, they're going to start producing their own content because it's a consumption-based audience. And if that's where it's going to go, the CRTC at some point in time needs to wake up and say, hey, listen, we need to figure out a model that works so that there is a percentage that is now going to be able to come into the market that can now support Canadians. So if the reality is that the tax credit does go away, we as Canadians have been spoiled for so long to depend on that. Where are we going to become creative from a business standpoint to turn around and say, hey, now we can go to this avenue and now begin to collaborate with bigger brands. So now not just worry about going to broadcasters down in the States, you can now go to agencies and say, hey, we've got this great concept for a show. We want to do a show about this coffee shop and it'll be paid for through such and such ways. That's where I think it really needs to kind of begin to build itself from. And I think that if we don't begin to look at that, we will become the music industry and it will all be online. I mean, hackers are doing tons of stuff with content right now. Can you imagine what would happen if somebody built something that rerouted all the content into one single touch? And you just had a box that was the size of like a hard drive. And you just click and play. Bye-bye revenue sources, bye-bye content. You'd be dead in the water. All of us would be out of work and we'd be producing stuff for free, like people are doing for YouTube now and getting paid 9 cents a click. So I think that if we don't do something from a formula standpoint with the CRTC now, 10 years from now, we won't even be having this conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to do legal work for the guy that came up with that box. That would be like a great fee. But kidding aside, I hear what you're saying. I mean, one of the issues though is that, again, the chair being very consumer friendly, again, being devil's advocate, they might say, well, if we charge Samsung or LG or whatever, then the prices will go up for consumers for the devices, and then the consumers will say, that's not fair, you're making us pay indirectly for it. So, but I think on...
How does that differ from the environmental tax?
Well, and gasoline tax.
Right.
And lotteries in England.
I mean, anyways, so what's the difference from a consumer standpoint, from a Canadian standpoint? Sorry to cut you off, but from a Canadian standpoint,
you're right.
We keep taking it and taking it, but nobody stands up to say, "Oh no, stop! That's enough." I mean, if you did that in the States, gosh, they start burning down gas stations. Here we just say, "Oh well, okay." Yeah. Oh well, okay. Right? You don't see TVs now all of a sudden from Costco's, being purchased for a lesser price. Like, okay, if I gotta pay it, I gotta pay it. Off I go. The government still has money rolling in. Yeah. So if you were to have some sort of a funnel that came in, as Brian mentioned, in terms of a percentage that came into the industry, that I think that people would then know that, okay, listen, at least this is where it's being fueled from on a long-term basis, as opposed to going into government coffers.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I mean, it's public policy choices at the end of the day. I mean, there's all sorts of taxes. Sure.
Because I know time is getting short here. I just wanted to pick up on this and actually throw something to the creators as well. You know, simply because when you spend a lot of time with screenwriters, you do think like them, which I'm privileged to say. But I'm not a screenwriter, and you know, I'm simply an administrator. And I would like to know, you know, I think creatively, it probably not be ideal to be working strictly for brands and integrating content. You know, I certainly spoke to Hart Hansen about, you know, he's done that on Bones, etc. Maybe it would feel like for creators, and this is the fine line between cultural content and making a profit and looking at it strictly as a business, as to writing a commercial. And just to throw out the idea about, you know, new sources of revenue, I don't think it's integration. I think that creatively that would be perhaps a problem for those who create. And, you know, looking down the line, you know, looking at what happens in Europe, I do hear about the ISP tax, et cetera. We've already been to the Supreme Court about that. So, you know, it's not that the guilds and unions haven't looked at that. That's, I think, a conversation that can continue. But what's happening in Europe as well is levies on the hard goods. And that's been the case for the last 150 years. Levies on the computer, levies on, you know, the iPad, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I know that music has tackled that and not dealt with that successfully, but that's not to say that we can't take another kick at the can. And, you know, certainly we're going to have to think of creative ways. But just to stress the urgency of this that, you know, Michael was saying, you know, yes, we're looking 10 years down the line, but we also have to live in today, and we can't wait to be soothsayers and see, yes, this might be the model for the future. Right now we need to deal with over-the-top broadcasters. We need to get them covered. We need to deal with the system we're in today. And then, yes, 2 or 3 years from now, look again. But, you know, I think what stymies us is that it becomes too big and that we don't actually do anything because there are so many big ideas. And we need to really be practical right now and do what's necessary. And if I could just throw that over to the creators, I'd really love to hear what they think about writing integrated content.
Okay, sure.
You like it? What about one of the writers?
Okay.
Sorry.
So we have a debate between two writers here. That's good.
I've done it extensively, and it just always stands out, and the audience makes fun of it. I mean, I just don't think it's.
So you think it doesn't work generally?
No, and they don't see it on the good shows that I like to watch. I don't know. It just doesn't.
It doesn't seem to me that what we're asking of our, you know, the CRTC is to give us tips on how to get creative and partner with, you know, various other potential advertisers. I think that as Brian pointed out, there's a tremendous amount of money in this system, and I think that what we're essentially asking for is a new model for channeling, in recognition of its cultural importance to us, a new model for channeling some portion of the enormous revenues that are being made into cultural product. It makes good cultural sense and it makes good industry sense. I mean, this is a huge industry in Canada now, and we're running the risk of it, you know, if we don't act fast, of it crumbling.
Yeah, I mean, I think in fairness to the CRTC, like Maureen, you'll remember the iPod tax was a big political issue. And the Conservative government ran in part on no iPod tax. We're not going to give you an iPod tax. So I think, you know, the CRTC as the regulator can't, you know, do things that only the federal government can do. So I think regardless of what you think of the merits of it, which I think, you know, you could certainly argue the merits of some of these fundraising approaches, that would be something the government of Canada would need to take a position on. And so the CRTC, I think, really is in a more limited role when it comes to that sort of a thing of imposing taxes or fundraising. What they can control is the programming and the monies that are invested in that, and what goes on and what kind of shows.
If they want to reduce don't debundle my shows, reduce my roaming fees, we have the highest cell phone costs in the planet.
Well, that's something they can do.
It's the same companies.
Okay.
Rogers is doing both of the
Yes.
things. So if they want to take some money and give it back to me, that's how I'd like it, please.
Yeah, well, when you talk bandwidth and you talk roaming fees, that's their bailiwick. So
Yeah.
all those ideas, I think, are very doable. Sorry, you had a comment.
Hi, I'm Nicole St. Martin. I'm with ACTRA. Jenny touched on this, and I think somebody else touched on it briefly, but I'm really concerned about children's programming, because if we don't establish for young ones right now, I have a 3-year-old. When I was a kid, I grew up on Mr. Dress Up, on Today's Special, on Polka Dot Door, on the Beachcombers. I was infused with that, and I didn't think to myself consciously, oh, I'm watching Canadian content. But I recognized myself in those characters. I recognized the places. I knew I was from that. I knew I was a part of that storytelling. My son does not have that now, and I don't know if he ever will. And the thing is if we don't establish now that these kids see themselves in the content of their storytelling, the storytelling that's meant for them, for their age groups, it won't matter 10 years from now what's on our televisions, because they won't recognize themselves. They won't have a cultural identity. So I think children's programming is really key to this whole discussion, and I'd really like to propose that to the CRTC, that they really consider that and make that a priority.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, now, the system now, as you know, is that you have various children's services, Family Channel, which DHX Media is just buying as part of the divestiture required to let Bell buy Astral. So Family Channel's going over with a couple of Disney channels. You've got, obviously, Teletoon and services like that. But the system has been big-ticket American shows, which I'm sure your kids will see. My kids grew up on Hannah Montana's and on Selena Gomez and shows like that. But then the Canadian shows are all around them, because they do still have the quota. So I guess, and I'm not suggesting it's working necessarily, but the theory was that you're going to watch Hannah Montana, and then you're going to watch Shake It Up, and that's the next show, and that's a Canadian show, and it's made here. It's all Canadian kids, and it's made by Temple Street, and so you'll watch the Disney show, and you'll watch the Temple Street show, and you'll get the exposure. That's been the approach. It's certainly different. I agree, when I was growing up, it was just the Mr. Dress-Ups and all of that gentle Canadian shows that were very different than American shows. Like, you think of Mr. Dress-Up, I guess you were on Mr. Dress-Up. That's the type of show. It's hard to see that happening, in other countries that have a kind of more violent culture. A show that is that gentle succeeded. But
so we've got about half an hour left, and want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to contribute if they haven't had a chance to contribute yet. So make sure you get your hand up high and.
Off the last question, my name's Dave Diaz. I'm a writer who's here with the Writers Guild. I work primarily in animation and kids programming, so I think I could answer some of that stuff. The last question directly is that it's the same. I think with live action, is that there's just very little shelf space for Canadian-made programs in kids programming at all. We have some of the best. Like, the problem, I don't think, is the people who make it. We've got some of the best writer, directors, animators, production companies that really know their stuff, right? We are the result of the tax credit system that has been built up to this point. We have a thriving creative community that can do these kind of things. I can't help but see the broadcasters as the weak link in all this, because the reason why everyone loves American programming so much is because they actually spend money on it. NBC or whatever, their entire slate is pretty much NBC programs. They spend money on it, right? Canadian broadcasters allot a very small amount, the absolute minimum they can do, while they're making reams of money off of these other shows. Like, why there's no as many Canadian-made kids shows is because it's all Disney. Disney Junior Canada shows, they make 1 or 2 shows a year, and it says Canada on it. Yeah. It's ridiculous. And yet, of course, Astro or whoever wouldn't necessarily allow Disney Junior themselves to come in and broadcast straight up, because that's too much competition for them, So they want to have their cake and eat it too. But you know what? It's time to pony up. And because I'm not so worried about broadcasters fizzling out when people stop watching TV. They're going to be moving to the internet to be doing that stuff. We're still going to have to watch NBC shows through an NBC portal
regulated by the CRTC or probably because agencies like Rogers and Shaw and stuff, they don't want to have true competition, or they're not going to have any broadcasting. Everyone can just turn to the American stuff. So it's time for them to partner up with this in a much more significant fashion to say, look, you know, we should have way more shelf space for the American, like for the quality program that we're capable of making. And the reason why we don't have as many big hits internationally is just we have made less shows on far less money. We've actually been able to make some pretty amazing stuff on relatively shoestring budgets compared to a lot of the American stuff. So, you know, that's all I can think about.
But you could argue that it will only get worse, though, because if you think about it, let's stipulate that we have really talented kids producers, which I think are recognized around the world through awards, through other mechanisms as being, you know, the best kids producers among them in the world, right? But if you look at your example, right, so now there's a certain amount of shelf space reserved for Canadian shows, and maybe they could increase the shelf space. And as you say, Disney can't come into Canada directly, nor can Showtime come in directly. In other words, there is a list of services that are not allowed to come directly into Canada. And you're right that Astral and people like that lobbied and said, we don't want Disney to come directly and we don't want Showtime to come directly in. And the services that we do have that are Disney branded are all owned by Canadian broadcasters. So if you see Disney in the name, or you see HBO Canada, or you see Smithsonian Channel Canada, one I was just working on, there's a Canadian that owns that service, and the Americans have lent the name and some programming. So, but going back to your point, the Americans have 350 million people. We only have 30 million. They have giant multinational companies that have assets around the world and theme parks and so forth. Our companies are much smaller. They have much bigger markets, so they can spend more money on a show. Makes sense. We're a much smaller country. We have smaller companies. They're big companies by our standards, but smaller by world terms. So, you know, and now, as we've all been talking about, you're getting the unregulated services coming in. And so, you know, who knows when you might be able to access this stuff more directly. In other words, up to now, there hasn't been Disney in Canada, there hasn't been Showtime in Canada directly, there hasn't been HBO in Canada directly. Yes, we watch the shows. You know, your kids watch it on the Family Channel, the Disney show, but Disney doesn't deliver it to you, it just licenses it to a Canadian-owned service. So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, what do you think, agreeing with what you're saying, what's the answer? What should the CRTC be doing going forward to deal with this?
I think stop being so soft on the broadcasters. I think that's what it is. Okay. With the proportionate amount of profits that they make versus the spend, it's just, it's not feasible towards maintaining a proper venue for Canadian culture to be broadcast on TV.
So you think more Canadian shows? Requirement to air more Canadian shows.
There's a lot of big shows that are starting to come up where it's like we're hitting our stride. You know, shows like Orphan Black and you know, we were talking Corner Gas a while ago. It's like that show. These are Canadian icons, right? And they're known around the world, and we need more of those. You know, we can make them. We've proven it. So, you know, we need an opportunity to be able to make more and show, you know, Canadians out there that we've got the stuff to compete. You know, but financially, we're not being given the chance to compete. You know, it's disproportionately not in the broadcaster's favor.
Yes, I watch Orphan Black, and I'm always amazed at Tatiana Maslansky, who plays 10 clones. Anybody who ever sees the show? I always think that's got to be the hardest acting job in North America, huh? 10 different roles every show? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I think you're stuck on me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
David, you're getting so excited.
Good. That's good.
A great. That is a great suit.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you.
Somebody's got to comment on that.
Thank you.
Anyways, my name's Steve Lucas. I'm a member of the Writers Guild of Canada, and I've been a writer-producer since about, I don't know, somewhere in the 1800s. And when I started, you know, we were getting the kinds of numbers that Aaron and Michael's shows have been getting, and in the million-plus range. But that was only because there were 10 or 12 channels, you know. The thing is, when you're in the middle of something, you forget that it's evolving, right? And these guys are proof, their shows are proof, and what you're saying is it's proof that it's evolving. But the thing we don't have in this country, and the thing most content providers want to have, frankly, is a Canadian Breaking Bad, a Canadian Mad Men, a Canadian Sopranos, a Canadian The Wire. When you go into the boardrooms of the channels and you propose that, they look at you like you're nuts, because it will not work for their audience, and we all know that, so we back off, right? But that is the goal. If you want to keep talent in the country, if you want to keep moving forward, if you want to keep guys like Denis Villeneuve and Sarah Pauly and Jean-Marc Vallée and all these guys here making shows, as opposed to down there in LA we go, then there has to be an opportunity somewhere in this country to make great shows. And there's only two ways I can think of doing it. And Michael's pounded on one, and Brian's pounded on one, and that's to hold these guys to ransom until they pony up the cash. The other way is to say, well, why don't you become Netflix? You've got everything else. Why don't you do one of those? Why don't we have a Canadian Netflix, a Canadian iTunes, a Canadian Amazon, where it's possible to play Major League global ball? It just isn't here right now.
Yes. BlackBerry's struggling on top of it all. And just before then, so you think the solution in part would be to require more expenditure, to require the broadcasters to spend something in the ballpark of what a Breaking Bad
Well,
would
I
be,
don't.
or,
Well, maybe, but I
I'm
don't want to.
just asking.
I know, but it's either carrot or stick.
Okay.
The stick is to require them to spend more.
Okay.
The carrot is, please create a channel, a dedicated channel where this is possible in this country. Canadian owned, Canadian run.
Well, we have CBC. What about CBC?
But they're conventional broadcast, and these shows aren't possible in conventional broadcast in the States either.
Right.
But if you look at the Emmy Awards every year, it's to weep, because those are the shows, those best drama shows, those best comedy, those are the shows we want to do, and we can't.
Yes, and as you know, there's a lot of Canadian talent involved in many of those shows.
Yes, there is.
Which is also too bad as well. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's David Heath, and I helped launch the TV festival last month, but just greatly supported by the CMPA. But my question's got nothing to do with that. And it's actually a question, maybe for you or for the floor, because you just mentioned services that are not allowed into Canada.
Right.
But the grandfathered services that are allowed, like the A&E and TLC, every couple of years there's an application to take the ad revenue. Because they're still broadcasting their U.S. ads. And every couple of years there's an application to the CRTC to take that ad revenue and insert Canadian ads. And it always gets turned down. Do you know, has someone else trying to do that
I think
again?
George Berger was the last one who tried to,
seems,
he had a proposal to do that.
It seems another source of revenue is my point.
Yeah,
so I don't know
for
why
whatever reason, I've never been involved in one of those applications, so maybe someone here knows more, but yes, it's true that there have been efforts to redirect that revenue for some, Canadian supported service, but for whatever reason they haven't been approved. I think in some cases there was a concern that it was self-serving on the part of the people that were applying. In other words, they would be getting themselves a share of the money.
They always promise to put some money towards
absolutely,
the system, don't they?
Absolutely. But no, it's a good point. It's a good point. But in general, the whole issue I think is that what you're talking about, which is some things like A&E were allowed into Canada, CNN is allowed into Canada, and then these other services weren't. And it was, again, going back to the old model of Canada being sealed off. So this is another example of that model of Canada being sealed off, where originally the theory was that you can't let Disney come in directly because we need to grow the Canadian service, and if they come in directly, that will be it for the Canadian service. And in fact, I'm sure that did help to promote the Canadian services, but now ironically you have all the people that aren't allowed to come in directly, all their programming is nevertheless here. I'm sure that all of us could find at home tonight Disney, HBO, Showtime programs to watch without, never mind AMC, where of course you can just see Walking Dead and Talking Dead and whatever you want directly. So, but I do think it's time for the CRTC to revisit that. And I don't say it with telling them how to revisit it, but I do think this would be a good time to look at that issue. Once you're looking at Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, you might as well look at these rules that prohibit people from coming and whether or not they make sense, that whether you strengthen them, whether you weaken them. I think it would make sense to do that as well.
And
Yes.
we have about 15 minutes left.
Oh, 15-minute
So why
warning.
don't we take this last 15 minutes and turn it into like in Parliament where it's member statements? And so that you have an opportunity, if you haven't said anything, or if there's something that you want to say that you didn't get a chance to say before, here's your opportunity to say it. We won't have the debate until after everyone's had an opportunity to say everything that they want to say. How about that?
Okay, member
I'll try to
statement.
fit that mold. So I guess what I want to do is actually answer your question of what should the CRTC do, and we've been hearing some great things, and this friend here had some fabulous words to say on that. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about for many years as we've gone and testified in front of the CRTC before from ACTRA. It's time for the CRTC, and it sounds disparaging, but for them to do their job, which is to protect Canadian culture, to ensure that there's regulations that promote Canada and Canadian talent and get our voices heard. And we've seen the slippage that takes place. You know, Global Television was apparently created as a 100% Canadian broadcaster. That's all they were going to have on there. And we've shown charts at the CRTC that show that now, many years later, they have 0 Canadian content during prime time in terms of drama. Obviously, they have news magazines and news shows, but in terms of Canadian drama, 0 during prime time. We've seen other broadcasters where it's down to one hour a week or an hour and a half a week. It's really difficult as an artist and a creator in this country to watch that happen. Now we've seen them regulate it so that they must create Canadian content, but they can show it on their specialty channels, which was spoken to in terms of we can't access that unless you pay for the extra level of cable. The changes that are taking place, you know, Netflix costs $7.99 a month, but in order to access it for my family, I now need to pay Rogers $110 a month in order to get unlimited bandwidth and not be paying more and more. Those cable companies are crying poor, and for whatever reason, it seems that the CRTC has decided that supporting the business concerns of the broadcasters outweighs anything that their mandate calls them to do on behalf of Canadian culture. And it's frustrating. They need to hold the broadcasters' feet to the fire. They need to demand that they pay for services. And they need to send a message, unfortunately, to consumers to say, I know you'd like to get everything for free all the time and never pay the content creators, but in fact, content doesn't just rise up out of the ground with no effort or sweat. People deserve their pay, and so there's going to have to be some kind of funding model. And Brian's talked about those, but when the iPod tax, was passed over, music, as this gentleman was referring to, it doesn't occur for free either. And it's got to the point now where our musicians in this country are earning their living only by selling their own CDs at their concerts and not through the traditional means of the past. We're on an unfortunate slippery slope, and as new technologies come along, we need the CRTC to get out ahead of this and to actually find a way to ensure that these content questions and Canadian content, Canadian voices are protected, or they'll be lost we'll just be trapped in a sea of world voices, and being Canadian won't matter in that sea. So.
We've got a lot of producers in the room. We haven't heard from producers yet. Remember CMPA staff?
Yes.
I'll just do one short one so that maybe Scott can speak as well. I think what we're trying to address with the CRTC are some problems and some challenges that are fairly short term, and the world will change and adapt, and consumers will get their fair share, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that sort of strikes me is that it is an issue of public policy, and our public policy with the CRTC is based on the Broadcast Act. And how old is the Broadcast Act, Jay? When was it written? When?
Early 90s.
Yeah. Early 90s. So, we have a world that's 25 years later, and I think fundamentally, while we're dealing with the short-term issues, the medium-term issues, you really have to redefine what your basis is. You need a new, not Broadcast Act, you need a Canadian Media Act. And that is something that has to happen in parallel with everything else. Because if you don't have that as a fundamental direction, you're not going to get culture, you're not going to get jobs, you're not going to get an industrial strategy.
Makes sense. Scott?
It's Scott Garvey from Shaftesbury. I agree with everything my friends are on the table here say about Mom Apple Pie, Canadian culture. We're unabashedly Canadian company producing great Canadian content that's 10 of 10. But I sort of was listening to what David was saying about what can the CRTC actually do versus what we're saying in a bigger space. Here's what they can do. This is not their bailiwick at all, so we have to do that. And it's sort of ironic that a lot of what I'm hearing around the table is that we want to get rid of those broadcasters and create content and go other ways. So we sort of are saying, let's get rid of the Broadcast Act, let's go to these other platforms and find new business models, which is sort of ironic, I thought. I think the Commission has to be vigilant, do their job, as someone over there said. We have broadcasters that aren't complying with the spirit or the intent of what their terms of license are. We have an opportunity where they're asking how benefits should be used. And we should be speaking with a one voice on that and saying we really believe that the Commission needs to do what they can to help Canadian companies and Canadian talent create great Canadian shows, and we have the talent base here to do it. So let's make those broadcasters use that money in a way that isn't self-serving. I think we have to focus on P&I as opposed to, we have a number of broadcasters who are meeting their commitments by doing unscripted reality shows as opposed to great Canadian content. So, but we also have a bag of tools in Canada that is fantastic. We have service credits where we don't even need a broadcaster. We have domestic credits where we need a trigger broadcaster. And to something Ira said at the very beginning, maybe we should be looking at the thresholds to get access to these other funding and take the broadcaster out of don't have them as the bottleneck to get commission. We're going to create content, we're going to find homes for that content, we're going to create business models that make sense, and maybe they're standing in our way. But we also don't want the Commission to stand in our way. And so we have a division called Smoke Bomb that's doing digital content, and it's quite refreshing not have to worry about 10 of 10. And so do we really want the Commission to get involved in that space where we're going out in a very market-driven, we're still using Canadian talent, but we're not having to worry about those regulations. It's very refreshing. So I'm not quite sure where this is all going other than I want the Commission to do its job. I think in the short term, there's still a very viable business opportunity here, and we want these broadcasters to do what they're supposed to do, and we want the Commission to do what they're supposed to do, and we want them to be partners with us to find a way down the future.
And what about the promotion of Canadian shows? Do you think that that's being done well enough, or?
I think everybody has stories about they wish a broadcaster would have done a better job releasing a show, and all of us have shows that when we first launched Listener, Yvonne Fassan did a fantastic job launching that show. So I think we have a real varied, there's some great jobs, there's some bad jobs, and I think it's contingent on us and social media to do our jobs to help create that audience awareness and audience engagement.
So you think the producer really needs to
Producers
take ownership
and the
of
guilds and
Facebook and Twitter and Instagram?
If it's not being done
Tumblr
properly by the
and
broadcaster, then we should do it for sure.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Karen Ivany. I'm with Actor Toronto, and I'm a Canadian actor. So my stake obviously is in scripted comedy and drama, and there's not a lot that I can say at this point that hasn't been said. So, and I agree with so many fantastic ideas, but I just wanted the CRT to draw their attention to the fact that we are all here. We are all here as Canadian creators, and we could all be somewhere else, most likely down south, making a heck of a lot more money. And I believe it's Michael over there who was saying, for some bizarre reason, he still works here. And I just want the CRTC to maybe, contemplate on that bizarre reason. And that bizarre reason is we have our own country and we have our own stories. And Canadian content, to definition, simply is it's something that's written, directed, acted, produced by Canadians. I don't know what the CRT's definition of a Canadian theme is. I don't know what a Canadian theme is. I know who I am as a Canadian person and how I differ from people who I know who are in the States. So that's all I wanted to say. We're here and we have a reason to be here. If not, we could just all go somewhere else for a lot more money.
Okay, thank you. Any other statements? Well, we may have exhausted the group.
Last chance.
Last chance. Going once, going twice. Well, thank you very much. I thought it was a really interesting discussion and a lot of different viewpoints. But I really want to thank all of you for participating, because I do think it's really important to get the views of creators over to the CRTC. They're going to be hearing from so many different stakeholders, so it's important to get these views out. I just want to thank you all for contributing. And thank you very much.